And especially since, you know, I'm not a trout fisherman at all, are the trout cranks? What's the thought process behind that? How do those? Because I thought, for trout, like Zach said earlier, you wanted to be kind of sneaky, approach them kind of easy. A crankbait is typically an action bait.
Right. Think about what I was talking about, rainbows and brown trout, the difference between the two.
Hmm.
A brown trout is your meat eater. He likes to chase stuff. He likes to eat other critters, right? So most of the time when I'm throwing a crankbait, I'm throwing it for bigger fish and I'm throwing it for a brown trout. Not always, but that's traditionally what I do. The other thing you'll find out about a trout is he sometimes can be a little bit um, intrigued by stuff, or he'll follow stuff. He'll chase stuff, right? And that's why the spinners work a lot of times on a fly. I mean, he's not really hitting that fly; he's hitting the spinner because it's just like something that gets his attention. And so the crankbaits a lot of times are because it'll get their attention. Sometimes they'll eat it. The smaller ones for the smaller streams, and then the big crankbaits are for out here in Arkansas when we're fishing these huge rivers, these tailwaters with high water, and you need something bigger to get down there and something bigger because a lot of our trout are eating other trout. So it's got to be a pretty good sized bait for them to eat it.
Makes perfect sense to me.
And that lends right into my next line of questioning. You've talked a lot about, the ultralight setups and stuff. When you're using a trout magnet on your basic stream to go after rainbows, what does your rod and reel setup look like?
It is huge to understand this, Doug. It's huge. I can't tell how many calls that call and say, hey, I'm using this trout magnet, I'm not catching any fish. The very first question I ask is, what pound test are you fishing? Because that's the most important thing in this whole scenario. If they're using 6 pound or more, I'll be like, man, I couldn't catch a fish on a trout magnet with 6 pound test. I couldn't do it. And I fish it all the time. It just doesn't work when you're using heavy line. It makes the lure almost float. And you can't cast, you can't get any distance on it. And so you've got to go down. We fish with 2 pound test all the time. I've caught fish that would change the way most people think about life. They're so big, right? And I fish 2 pound test. And so, you got to think, you got to take the whole idea that if I fish a 2 pound line, I can't catch a 4 pound fish. No. I mean, we've caught fish, 20 pounds on 2 pound test. And so, in fact, the other day we were brim fishing with 2 pound test, me and my son, and he caught about a 5 pound grinnell. Have you ever seen a grinnell look like a snakehead? And they are vicious. And we landed on that 2 pound test. You just got to take your time and slow down. So the first thing you got to have is light line. The second thing is, with that light line, a good color line. We use 2 pound SOS line, but we also use a fluorocarbon leader. A fluorocarbon leader for trout, in my opinion, is a must with a trout magnet. Most of the time, the water's so clear that they can see your lure, see the line, see something that spooks them. Fluorocarbon is just completely clear in the water, and you add 12 to 18 inches of it, of the same diameter or smaller of the main line you're fishing, and it increases the amount of fish you catch for trout. Other species, you don't have to do that. But for trout, it's a must. Their eyesight's the number one form of defense. So 2 pound test, a fluorocarbon leader where the water's clear. And then I want a rod longer than most people would think you need for trout, at least 6, 6.5, 7 feet or longer, because it allows you to have a cushion for that light line. It allows you to cast further. It allows you to fight the fish on that light line, much, much better than a shorter rod does. So 6.5 foot would be my ultimate, 6.5 with a fast tip. When you shake that rod, if it acts like a noodle, don't use it with a trout magnet, because when you go to set the hook, you won't get the hook in the top of his mouth. It just doesn't give you that pop. So we call it a medium light. It's not an ultra light. So it's got a little bit of backbone to it. An open face reel with something with a metal spool with a good drag system because you're fishing light line. Those types of reels, are pretty easy to find. They're not super expensive. You can get one for probably $20, $30. Now there's nicer ones out there, and typically with it, you're paying for a better drag and something that won't, go bad getting wet. But we have a pretty good setup. It's called an SLS rod. We sell a couple different ones, but the SLS rod is my favorite. And it's just a 6'6" medium light rod. It's perfect. We also sell Shimano reels, but we have one called a Ballo reel, which is a $24.95, reel with a good drag system on it. Perfect for fishing a trout magnet. So that we've made that because a lot of people ask for it, but there's a lot of them out there that have a good rod and reel setup in that 6 foot 6 rod length, and a metal spool, 1,000 size reel or smaller.
So you're going just as light as possible.
Light as possible, yeah. And with that light line, you don't need a big spool because it just takes too much line anyways.
And then, so what's the presentation look like? How are you using a float of some kind?
Yeah, or... Great question. And with a trout magnet, you can fish without a float. For the first 10 years I used it, I never used a float. Once we started fishing a float for steelhead, it kind of transferred into the trout magnet. And when we started using it, it blew my mind that I could still catch them with that float. To be honest with you, on most days, I use a float 99% of the time. And what I do is I take that float and I look at the water and I say, well, that river looks 4 feet deep. I'll make my float 4 feet deep. Up from my trout magnet, I'll peg it with that easy trout float, which, slides up and down easily. And then I'll cast upstream and I'll drift it over them. Just like a fly fisherman drifting that bug across the bottom. I want that trout magnet to be as close to the bottom without touching it as I can get. When that float does anything, I whack them. If I drift it and I don't get a hit or hit the bottom, I'll go about 5 or 6 inches deeper and I'll make the same drift. A trout does not want to feed up. Unless he's going for bugs on the top, most of the time he's going right or left, feeding along the bottom as stuff drifts down through the current. And so I'm just mimicking something that's drifting along the bottom, and he thinks it's food and eats it.
And that drift part's important because if you cast right on top of where you think the fish are, does it scare them?
You bet. You want to get above them and make it drift. You want that float on top of the water to look like a leaf drifting, which means that trout magnet below is just going the same speed of the river. And if you watch some of the videos, just go to YouTube and search how to fish a trout magnet. Look for the ones where we're drifting it, where we're waiting. And you'll see we're casting upstream, drifting, kind of popping it, just checking our slack as it goes. When it gets below me, sometimes I'll even open that bail and let it go another 5, 10, 15 feet and close my bail if a fish hits it. That way I've increased the distance I can catch a fish by another 10 or 15 feet. Casting upstream and downstream, I've got a pretty big area that I'm covering.
Sounds like about as basic as it gets. I mean,
it really is.
That's simple.
It is, and when it's funny, I took a really famous crappie fisherman fishing about 2 weeks ago, and he came down here, and he did it because we're filming a new YouTube channel with B&M for a crappie line, and he's going to head that up, and he's like, man, Jeff, he said, I can't believe when I came down here, I thought of trout fishing as dough bait and worms and corn, and he said, when I saw your system, I was like, there's no way this is going to work. And we caught 280 fish in 2.5 days. And he was beside himself, thinking, I can't believe it's this simple. But even when people look at it, they want to change some of the stuff we've done, and that's fine. But the system we have is really a system and not just a lure. The trout magnet works great, but if you don't use light line and a float and a fluorocarbon leader and a decent pole, you're really going to struggle catching it. If you don't present it the way we're showing, it doesn't work that well. But once you see it and you go, whew, that's pretty easy, the numbers start going through the roof.
Sean, you got anything else?
No, I'm ready to get some trout magnets.
I know a guy. I'll take care of you. I know this guy. He's pretty good guy.
Jeff, is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap it up?
No, I enjoyed talking to you guys, and good luck with your podcast here. Hopefully it goes well. Talking about the outdoor lifestyle is what we live. We eat, we drink, every day, hunting and fishing, and just being outside. There's something about it that connects you to the one that created all of it, I believe. So I hope it goes well for you.
It's been good so far. The more I get into it, the more I realize there's some very interesting people and organizations out there that have a story to tell. You bet. There really is. It's kind of neat, hearing the stories, and then it gives you motivation too to try things. I'm a big believer in following your dreams. I believe you test that dream by saying, is it going to separate me from God? Is it going to separate me from my family? If it does neither of those two things, then you go for it and try your best to try to make it. Because when I told people I was going to make fishing lures for a living, they laughed at me. And I was a little concerned myself. It sounded a little bit too far-fetched. But working hard and God opening up doors, 25 years later, I'm still doing it. And so, I'm a big believer. And if you've got a dream in the outdoor industry, go for it. If it's not going to hurt you or your family or separate you from, the creator, then you just try and see what happens. So what if you fail? At least you've tried. That's it. That's some good life advice. Jeff, thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Hey, you too. God bless you guys. Sore lip them all.
Oh, yeah. If you'd like to follow us on Facebook, we have a Facebook page called 12 Hike. and we are also on Instagram, the 12 Hike Challenge.